All right, on to our seminar for the day. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Andy Miller. Andy Miller is a lead safety representative for the Milwaukee FSDO in the Great Lakes region. He also worked with AOPA as part of their safety foundation for 10 years and now works as their aviation ambassador. Did I get that right?
Yeah,
if you guys have not seen Andy speak before, you are in for a real treat. He's a fantastic presenter. He's going to give us a runway safety update. So I asked Andy Miller to come on up, and we're going to present you with our certificate of appreciation. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Kevin.
And welcome. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very, very nice to be with you here this morning and to be with my friends from the FAA FAST team, all of whom are in the Great Lakes region. So I've had the opportunity to work with all these guys just in the last year or so. And very nice to be kind of starting off Oshkosh first thing in the morning here. So thank you for joining us. We're going to talk a little bit this morning about runway safety. And you've heard a lot about runway safety. I'm sure you've all had classes and seminars and things about runway safety. And it's a topic that's one of those that we can't know enough about. The folks that sit in dark rooms and think about really gloomy things like people dying, and there are such people at the FAA, at AOPA, at the universities, they think about what could get us. And they tell us the riskiest thing for us as pilots is on the airport surfaces. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense, because when we're flying the airplane, you know, we've got all of the things that out there to protect us along that. You know, all of our training, all of the rules, all that. And even if we're off a little bit, if we're even 150 feet off of our assigned altitude, for example, or we're flying VFR and we're just on the hemispheric rule, we're at 4,500, something like that, and we're just off that little bit. Another airplane would actually have a very hard time hitting us. We call it the big sky theory, and some of the pieces that go with that. Whereas, as you get closer and closer to the airport, we have a greater concentration of airplanes. And where are they the most concentrated? Right on the runways and the taxiways. So that's where those statisticians tell us we've really got to be careful. And the worst aviation accident in history was a runway issue, in the Canary Islands that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. So, so we don't want to be that. We don't want to be that statistic. You don't want to be the pilot that we're talking about at one of these seminars in a couple of years. So I'm really glad you're here. We'll try to refresh you on a couple of the basics and talk about it from a conceptual standpoint. But my goal certainly this morning is just so that the next time you go flying, you remember that time when you're taxiing around and taking off and then landing and taxiing back is just as important, if not more important, than any other part of the flight. We have a tendency as pilots sometimes to only think about the flying. And some of that's the fault of flight instructors like myself. When we do flight reviews and stuff, we're always thinking about the practice area and doing those steep turns and all that kind of stuff. And hopefully the flight instructors emphasize airport operations just as much because they're equally important. And we'll talk that through. So for those of you that have not met me before, as Kevin mentioned, I'm based right here in the Great Lakes. In fact, just about 12 miles up the road in Appleton, Wisconsin. And there's my Skylane, which those of you that have been with me before have heard many stories about. It's a wonderful old 1973 Papa model that is proof of the fact that aircraft owners are not always sane. Because the airframe was worth about $60,000, and my airplane partner and I put another $45,000 of avionics into it. Doesn't make any sense at all, but the airplane's very important to me, and now it'll do everything that we need. And then one of the cool things about taking the new position at AOPA is I now am assigned one of the AOPA Yellowbirds. And I get to take this to events all over the Great Lakes region. Some of you from other parts of the country may have seen some of my colleagues that fly. We have 5 of these in all, spread in different points around the country. But very, very fun. And it's here at AirVenture. Any of you, as you're out flying the grounds, please stop by and say hi. And we've got cool things. We've got some things for kids, too. Make sure you guys come over there. Okay, so runways. Let's start off with a near tragedy. Thank goodness this didn't end up as an accident or an incident. It was a runway incursion. But I want you to watch this video as it goes through, and try not to think too much about what almost happened. But think about the components of this, because this is a classic example of the Swiss cheese. You remember that accident chain idea that, we got the slices of cheese, and they hopefully, as we start down an accident chain, we hit one of those slices of cheese and that stops the accident from happening. But it's Swiss cheese, so there's holes. So sometimes the accident chain can get through there. And if we're really unlucky, it gets through another slice, through another hole, and through another hole, through another slice, and there we go. And I think that's what's going to be the case here. So, Gary, why don't you go ahead and play this? Gary, where did Gary go? So, if somebody can get a hold of Gary, oh, there he comes. Gary, can you play that video for us?
September 19, 2008, a Jet Air regional jet carrying 56 passengers nearly collided with the Cessna 172 at the Lehigh Valley Airport in Allentown, Pennsylvania. At approximately 7:30 p.m., half an hour after sundown, ATC cleared the Cessna to land on runway 6. Meanwhile, the departing airliner was instructed to hold short of runway 6 for the landing traffic. After the Cessna touched down, the controller cleared the airliner to taxi into position and hold, and shortly thereafter told the Cessna to exit the runway at Taxiway Alpha 4. He then cleared the airliner for takeoff, unaware that the Cessna had missed its assigned exit and was still on the runway. 10 seconds passed before the Cessna asked to turn off at Taxiway Bravo instead, by which time the airliner was well into its takeoff roll. The controller instructed the Cessna to turn immediately, but it was only the quick reactions of the airline crew that saved the day. They executed a high-speed abort and a dramatic swerve, missing the Cessna by only 10 feet.
So you can imagine how bad this could have been. If they would have overrun that Cessna, 56 people on the airliner, 2 people on the Cessna, 58. So as we see that whole thing, you can kind of understand how it happened, right? It sort of makes sense. But yet there were a lot of opportunities that could have prevented this from ever even being close to an accident, right? What's one thing you can think of here that any of the parties involved could have done that this would have not happened?
I totally would have been looking for that Cessna to turn off on Alpha 4, and if it didn't, I would have asked for clarification.
Okay. And speaking as a pilot?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, kind of picking up on that whole idea, both pilots, or crews I should say, have some responsibility here, right? The Cessna pilot was asked to turn off at an intersection. Now, do we have to do that as pilots if we're landing the airplane? No, we don't. But what phraseology are we supposed to use? Unable. Unable. We're supposed to say, if they say taxiway, whatever it was, Alpha 4, and that's just too close, we're going too fast, and we know that, and we don't want to have our airplane go off the runway because we're turning too quickly or whatever. We simply tell ATC unable. And if that controller would have heard the Cessna pilot say unable, do you think that would have changed the controller's approach? Absolutely. Now, what about the crew in the airliner? Where could they have stopped this accident from happening? Okay, you were talking from their perspective, yeah. Where should we always look before we take an airplane off the ground? In front of us. Now, in their defense, it was after sunset, but it wasn't dark. It was only 30 minutes after sunset, so it's still relatively light. And we're not talking about a whole lot of distance here. We're probably talking about 2,500 feet to 3,000 feet. Can most of us see a Cessna from 3,000 feet away on a runway? Yeah, we probably should have. Why wouldn't that crew have missed that, perhaps?
Lights off?
Lights off, yep. Perhaps the Cessna didn't have their lights off. Anything else that might have been the case?
Runway curve or runway drive?
Yeah, possibly sight lines. I don't think that was a factor in this case, but that would be in some situations. Yes?
They were getting ready to take off and doing their last minute check.
I would agree. And those of you that have flown jet equipment probably would also agree, wouldn't you? There's a lot to do in those kind of airplanes in those final steps before we actually get going. They're monitoring engine temps and all kinds of stuff going on, and there are systems that go with that. And is any of that more important than looking down the runway to see if there's an airplane there? No. So this is basic stuff, whether we're flying a Cessna 152, like I fly sometimes, or whether flying an Airbus 380. This is very basic piloting, that we always clear the runway before we take off, and of course opposite before we land. Bill?
Yeah, not even to interject something, but three things you can always think about anytime you get on a runway, under any condition. Look on short final, maybe control in mistake. Yep. Look down the runway, and then look at your heading card, make sure you're on the right runway 6, and the heading card says 090, got a big problem, wrong runway. And you add those three items to any checklist you have, plus I would say for a single engine airplane, how high above the ground do you need to be to have a thought about turning back towards something? That's a different story. But
Yep, the whole takeoff piece. Could everybody hear Bill's comment? So, and one of the things that he referred to is the runway heading, and I'm sure you're thinking of the Lexington, Kentucky accident, which was the last major loss of life that we've had. So those basic things. And one of the points here is it doesn't matter if we're in that little single engine piston or we're in a big airplane. All those things that he just talked about are things that we need to make sure that we do. Now, what about the controller? Yeah, the controller got in trouble for this. Yeah, they should have, before they said those words to the flight crew, clear to take off, the controller had a responsibility to find it. But we're in this together, and we have, the two pilots in the airliner, the pilot of the Cessna, the controller, and it's not a matter of blame here, because as we just discussed, any one of them could have prevented this whole thing. And you know what? Every day, several times a day around the country, things almost happened that didn't happen because we pilots did the right thing and the controllers did the right thing or whatever. We work for each other and make sure that we try to keep things safe. So we don't worry too much about blame in this particular kind of a case. Yes?
I'm a basket rep as well. And my question would be, how much prep time did that pilot in the Cessna do to become aware of the diagram of the runway? I see a lot of guys that don't have a clue when they're landing, and I'm not putting blame on it, but finding out and studying and pre-flighting to make sure because you're going into a busy airport.
Okay. I think there's another comment in the middle of the row there. Just behind there.
There's an acronym called TEAM, T-E-A-M. You've got three people that are involved. Together, each accomplishes more. T-E-A-M, together each accomplishes more.
Yep. Again, it is a very important point of that we're all in this together. So good thoughts, and we want to use this as kind of as that context for the rest of what we're going to talk about, because it doesn't matter how good we always are. Even if you are perfect, there's other players out here who aren't going to be perfect. So we've got to be doing this defensively, and back to that team idea of working together. So one of the most important things here, and this, of course, we illustrate this with a tailwheel airplane, but this is true for tricycle gear airplanes as well. We're operating that aircraft from the moment that we start up that engine to the moment that we've got it chalked again, the engine shut down and those chocks. And too many of us as pilots are only focusing on the flight portion of that. And that's why we do have a lot of things that don't kill people, but a lot of damage to airplanes and a lot of ruckus going on because folks don't put that same amount of attention. And we'll see some good examples of that here in a couple moments. And we talked a little bit about this whole risk side of it, about the fact that we're at these airports and there's all these other airplanes and all these other players that come into play with it. And there's many, many components, some of which you brought up in this particular case of the Allenton situation. Were they familiar with the airport, as she mentioned? in the airport layout, and how much runway is there, what are the pilot's skills, and can they land by Alpha 4? Maybe an experienced pilot could say, oh, that would be no problem at all, and if it's a student pilot, they might need the entire 6,000 feet. There are a lot of variables that go into this. And of course the visibility issues that go with weather and light as well. One of the biggest things that we see at the Air Safety Institute as we get the reports on these, and one of the most frustrating things, is when a pilot says to ATC, I'll do what you just told me. So the ATC tells the pilot, hold short of runway 30. Again and again and again, we get these accidents or these runway incursions where it's on the tape, where the pilot says, hold short of 30. And then they still go across the line. Now, why would that happen? Why would a pilot do that? Any ideas? Well, but why did they say that they would hold short of it if they were lost or if they weren't going to do it? Lack of situational awareness, perhaps, so that maybe didn't know where it was. Somebody. They just. Right. I think that this pilot's comment is probably the closest one for the majority of them. We have a tendency as pilots to go on autoplay. Like, like the new Garmin's have that replay button, play back what the ATC just said. We got those things in our brains too. And you just, especially if it's your home airport or an airport you fly from a lot, you know that when I get out here, they're going to tell me to hold short. And, they say it, and your brain does this autoplay thing, but it's just happening at a very superficial level of your brain. It's not happening deep enough to impact the actions that you're going to take. And that's a really frustrating thing for the entire industry. Why does this happen again and again? We're very big on this whole read back piece of it now, and in fact the FAA has become much stricter. That's considered a clearance, and we are always supposed to read back a clearance, and we're supposed to read it back correctly. And again, a lot of us do that, but a few of us then don't do what we said we would do. The other version of this, of course, is what we saw in the Cessna landing at Allentown. He was told to get off at Alpha 4. Now, he didn't say that he would do it, but he didn't say that he wouldn't do it either. We have to communicate on that, and there's sort of the implication that goes with it. When we tell a controller, when they give us a request or an instruction like hold short, that's basically a contract. When you read it back, hold short of 30, you've now made a deal to that controller. Hey, I'm going to hold short. So when we don't do it, it really screws stuff up. And what are some of the strategies that a pilot can use to not be on autoplay? Any of you have techniques that you use in your flying so that you don't just say back to the controller but not really hear what the controller said? Write it down is one of the very best ones. Thank you for bringing that one up. And there's science behind this. The folks that they like university laboratories where they wire up people's brains and stuff, and then they have you do stuff. They have found that when you hear it and write it down, it uses more of your brain than if you hear it and you say it. It uses different parts of your brain, quite honestly. So that's one of the reasons. And then in addition to that, you've also got it written down so that if you get confused or you forgot or whatever, oh yeah, there it is. So writing it down is a very, very good technique. Yes? Repeat it to yourself and visualize it. Another great one, and I especially like the comment about the visualization, because again, that's going to use more of your brain than the autoplay part uses. So when they say hold short of 30, and in your head you're thinking, oh, okay, there's the line, and 30 goes off that direction, that's going to get it deeper down into that brain so that you're conscious of it.
Sometimes if you got the 10-9 page out, you're actually tracking the progress on the page. That's a visual that confirms what they're saying. The 10-9 page is also confirming that if you've got that out while you're on the airport.
But that is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because what's the problem with that? Because now we're looking down instead of looking out, right? So, and I'm not saying that's a bad idea at all, but we have to really discipline ourselves not to be fixating on the devices inside the aircraft. They are very, very useful. They're good for a lot of things that you were talking about, supplemental information and situational awareness, all that good stuff. But we should be looking out the window the majority of the time. It's not the only piece of that. Okay, moving on. Let's do a little quiz here. We got some questions. We'll just kind of yell out what you think might be the answer here. What does this sign mean? A, B, or C? An entrance to a runway. Any other thoughts? Everybody vote for A? You're absolutely right. What's the tip-off here? The red. Yep, the red is the key. Anytime we see that red, that's a warning that now we are in an especially sensitive and important area, and generally that's going to mean a runway. What's this marking, and view it from the perspective of where we're coming towards it? What does that tell us? A, B, or C? Bravo, right? Solid lines. Now what if we were coming from the other way? We can go right through it, right? Dash through the dash lines, like the Kings like to say, but a solid line is solid. And this is, again, something that if those of you that maybe haven't been flying for a while, be aware of, that the hold short, we are, if we're given that instruction to hold short, we need to read that back to that controller. It's not just a advisory kind of thing. It's a clearance, and they really want to hear it back, hold short. In addition to that, especially when you're taxiing outbound, but even after a landing, heading back to your hangars or to the FBO or whatever, you cannot go across one of those lines without specifically hearing the words, cleared to cross runway XY, or whatever it is. Now this is quite a change, and this confuses some pilots, because in the past, if you were cleared to taxi to a runway, you could do whatever you needed to get there. And that was a dangerous thing. And so now the process has changed, and the controllers are required to give you the specific path, taxiway alpha, right on Bravo, hold short of 30, on and on. But they're going to you'll hear those specific words, hold short, and then again, as you get up to it, then you'll hear on the radio, clear to cross runway 30. The easy part of this is just as you're coming up on a runway marking like this, if you have not heard the words cleared to cross, don't go across that line. It's not that hard. There's no, even by the way, if the runway is closed, you cannot cross those lines without hearing the word, at a towered airport, without hearing the words cleared to cross. This gets to be a little hard at some airports. At my home airport, Appleton, if the winds are kind of going from a certain direction, I might have to cross 3 runways to get to it. So that generally means the controller is going to have me stop 3 different times and then give me the hold short clearance. Now in the middle of the night, when there's nobody else around, sometimes they will give me all of that stuff, right? And as part of my initial call-up, they'll say, go here, you're cleared to cross 12, then go there, and you're cleared to cross 21, and off we go. But that's a pretty rare situation. Most of the time, they stop you each time. But from your standpoint as a pilot, if you see those double solid lines, make sure that you have just heard the words cleared to cross. Now, what if you aren't sure? What if you get there and you just can't remember if you heard it or not? Stop and ask, absolutely. Do not cross that line because you think you were cleared. They would far rather have you, give it to you twice than to not give it to you enough. Because by the controllers don't like violations. They don't like it when pilots get in trouble. They try to avoid that as much as they can. So here he's got a microphone for you.
I think there's been a recent change. I believe there's been a recent change. They're not allowed to clear you to cross a runway until after they can't clear you to cross more than 1 runway at a time. Like even in the middle of the night, you have 1 at a time. They have to clear you for each one.
That's the default position from their training and stuff. But the FAA has a process where airports can actually get letters of authorization to do a little bit variation. So it depends on the airport and what the airport management has done and things like that. But you're absolutely right. The The standard for the FAA now is you have to get a specific clearance, you stop at each one and get cleared to proceed. All right, very good. Moving on. We talked about that one. Okay, here we're up at the FBO on the west ramp. We're taxiing to runway 34 via taxiway Alpha. So if you look, I'll go use this side here to illustrate, but Alpha is the one that's just to the west of the north-south runway there. And we're going out to 34, so, or down to 34, I should say. Where do we have to stop? A. A is the correct answer. Because again, we've been cleared, and this is the change from the old days. In the old days, if we were cleared to 34, we would just taxi on down there. Wouldn't matter that we had to cross that other runway. But under the new policy, we would have to stop there at position 9 until we heard the words cleared to cross runway 6 or cleared to cross runway 624 and get those words. Everybody get that? All right, number 4. Come on. Which surface, so what's going to be on the run or the taxiway surface itself will be co-located with the sign that's just below the question? Right, because we talked about this one earlier, right? This sign tells us that we're coming up on a runway, and if there's a runway, there's going to be a hold short line. Does that make sense? So if we're taxiing around in the airport and it's relatively low visibility or it's nighttime and we see a sign like this, what should we be looking for on the ground? The hold short line. It's there, and that's part of why they give us both. They're supposed to kind of work together to give us that indication, to be aware and be ready for it. What does this identify? A, B, or C? Any thoughts? B, I heard. Does everybody like B? Because that's the correct answer. Taxi route for 2 different runways. What does this sign mean? It's pretty self-obvious, isn't it? I'll bet even our future pilots here would have a general sense. If you saw a sign like that, what would you do? Stop, right? It's like a stop sign. So that's it. And these were the airport part of the FAA has been really working with airports to put more of these up. Because one of the problems we're having are unfamiliar pilots coming up on a driveway or a road that is being used by the fuel trucks and stuff like that, and an airplane starts heading down there, and they get there, and it's not big enough or whatever, and hard to turn around, causes a lot of grief. So the airports division of the FAA, as they go out and review airports, really is looking for those kind of things and asking those airports to put up more signage like this to help keep us out of trouble. Big part of that. All right, number 7. Same situations we had before, but a different runway. 1624 is closed, so we're going to go out to 24 via taxiway Alpha 2, Charlie, and Bravo. Where's the first place we have to hold until we get further clearance from ATC? What's the first spot? If we're heading out to 24, way out here, from here, and we're cleared Alpha 2 to Charlie to Bravo. Right, A, 11. So everybody getting that? That's really, really important to see. And again, it's very easy for us sitting here in a seminar to talk about this, but we will have a couple pilots today somewhere in the United States not do that. So that's why we keep beating your heads on it. What's the meaning of this sign? Identifies the taxiway. So not red, so we know that that's the taxiway. How about this sign? True or false? This is a location sign for runway 2. False. False. What is it? Distance remaining. So I'll be on the runway, and it'll tell us that we're getting close to the end, although I still got enough room for my 152. So I'm still good there. All right. Sterile Cockpit. And first of all, before we get the answer, is Sterile Cockpit a good idea when we're on the runways? Absolutely. And for those of you that fly as pilot in command, you should be very strict about this. Even with those special situations like Young Eagle flights and rides for people that we want them to have fun and we want them to have a great experience. But coach them in advance. Say, hey, when we're taxiing around the runway, I really have to be focused, and I've got to be listening to the tower if there is one, and I've got to be watching for the airplanes. So we can't really talk when we're still on the ground. But once we're in the air, then we'll talk. But when we're close to the ground and on the ground itself, sterile cockpit. And sometimes it's actually harder with friends and family members than it can be with strangers. Because at least I found that in my flying with some youngster that I'm giving a Young Eagle ride to. I'm pretty careful about doing the briefing and I talk to him all this stuff. But if I'm flying with my good buddy who's also a flight instructor and we see something interesting, somebody just had a bad landing in front of us and we start talking flight instructor talk, that's not a good thing. We're not following that sterile cockpit, so we need to discipline ourselves. And all of you should as well. Because this is, those kinds of conversations will distract us from back to the autoplay thing. That's one of the reasons why we might do that. Number 12, one more time on the same airport layout. Taxi to runway 6 via Alpha and Bravo. So we're going down here. Here's Alpha, here's Bravo. Just to make a simple right turn there. Which number? So, Charlie, correct, number 9. Because again, we can't touch this runway without specifically getting that clearance that we can do so. All right, here's one. We've just landed on 3-2, instructed to exit at Alpha, and we didn't do it for whatever reason. And is that okay from our perspective, if we can't turn off where we're supposed to? Yes, we own the runway. The only time that there would be a variation in that is if the airport has been approved for land and hold short operations. If you're in a land and hold short situation and you've accepted that, you'll be told in advance, land and hold short, and they'll tell you, of taxiway Alpha or whatever, but it's still up to you. And if you can't do it, what's the magic word? Or talked about it? Unable. That's all you need to know. The controllers, if you can turn off at Alpha, yeah, that makes their life go a lot better, and they'd love it if you can. But if you say unable, they're ready for that. They've already got a plan B. That's the way they're trained. They've always got plan Bs and plan Cs and plan Ds. They're ready for whatever might happen. So don't feel any pressure. If a controller asks you to land and hold short of something, or I should say just land and get off at an Taxiway. They don't use the word hold short. Do your best, but if you can't do it safely, simply use that magic word unable. Don't go making something happen. The FAA does not give out hero awards for being able to land an airplane that's going too fast, short of a taxiway. In fact, if anything, it'll get you in trouble because you're going to end up going off the runway and have a loss of control accident. We don't like things. So just simply say you're not able to do it, and it'll be fine. Don't feel like you need to. And there's a lot of reasons, and even very good pilots may have occasion where they can't do something they normally could. An issue with the airplane. I had something with my little Yellowbird last summer where the flaps wouldn't come down, and so it took a whole 1,000 feet instead of only 500 feet to land at that time. You just never know. But we should always be comfortable saying unable and that we need something else, because from the FAA's ATC standpoint, we own the runway. They're going to keep the whole thing clear unless it's a land and hold short type operation. That would be the one exception to that. So which is the right answer here? Come on. Okay. I think maybe my batteries are starting to go. I'm not sure here, guys. It is Charlie. All right, a couple more of these and then we'll move on. Come on. Which diagram would best illustrate what those signs are trying to tell us? And don't you love it when you get to these? Yep, so we got Bravo going off at an angle. You can see that. We got Foxtrot kind of coming to the back. Does that make sense? These can be tough to decipher unless you have a pretty easy tool. What easy tool can a pilot have with him or her that makes this stuff really easy to understand? An airport diagram, yeah. They're so easy to get these days. You can get them right from the FAA website, from the AOPA website, from AirNav. I mean, nowadays, ForeFlight and WingX and all those kind of products all have taxi diagrams. And, you know, that will make perfect sense to you if you're looking at that airport diagram. And again, there's no reason for us not to have that with us in the airplane anymore. And in fact, now when a new pilot is going for their first check ride, so like for the private pilot or the light sport or the recreational check ride, if they show up and they don't have a taxi diagram, that check ride's over. That's how important it is now to the FAA examiners that you have that. And a lot of us say, well, you know, I'm just flying from my own airport, and of course I know my own airport really well. But we had a terrible situation a couple years ago at Appleton with this, when the airport renumbered the taxiway, or the taxiway system. Because over time it didn't make much sense anymore, so they kind of started over, and so everything was in order. And we ended up having a number of people visiting the Milwaukee FSDO that summer. So have one with you. You just never know. You just never know. All right, come on. Okay, we've been told to taxi into position and hold. Again, some of you that it may have been a while since you were in aviation, this is what you're used to. This is now a whole new word. Yep, line up and wait. So be prepared for that. You won't be told to taxi into position and hold anymore. What you're going to hear are the words line up and wait. And this is causing a little bit of a problem for us in the runway world, because what are some pilots doing that's not the correct thing? They're lining up at the whole short line and waiting. Now, fortunately, that's not a dangerous thing. At least they're off the runway, whatever, but it's not right. It's adding confusion. And just so you know, the reason for this change is because we needed to get standardized with the rest of the world. Our pilots were going to other parts of the world, and in ICAO, which is the international organization for aviation, our pilots were going to other countries and being told to line up and wait, and they didn't know what to do, or they were, like I say, holding short at the whole short line. So that is replacing taxi into position and hold. So any of those situations. All right, last one, if we can get it to click. So, okay, just real briefly, surface markings. We talked a little bit about that the solid line is telling us that there's something there we want to be aware of, the dotted lines for moving out. This is another area that the FAA Airports Department is putting a lot of pressure on the airports to put better information for the pilots. There's many airports, as you know, that have a big ramp for the FBO, and at the end of the ramp is the taxiway to go right or left, right? Very common situation. Well, that's a taxiway, and you're supposed to have a clearance to go on that taxiway, but how do you know where it is if there's no line? So that's why the airport's office has been really trying to get the airports to put more of these markings out there to make it very clear for us where we can and can't go. Another kind of related thing is the other direction of clearly denoting the parts of our airports where we can go without having to talk to the tower. And a good example of that are some of the airports where there's fuel farms in proximity to the T-hangars. And you want to be able to go from the T-hangar out to the fuel farm to get 8 gallons of gas or whatever it is, and then come on back. And if the construction of the airport is in such a way that you can do that without going onto a taxiway, that's called a non-movement area, and you can do that without having to make that call, as long as it's a non-movement area. And by the way, that's totally counterintuitive, isn't it? Non-movement area is where you can move. It's non-movement to the airport, to the tower. So it's the opposite for us. That's an area where we can move. However, if any of you are operating at those kind of airports, particularly as your home airport, it might be worth a phone call to the tower someday to ask them if they want you to call. So for example, at Appleton we have that, and they said, yeah, you don't have to call us if you're just going to the fuel farm, but we sure would like it if you did, because that gives us the opportunity to know what's going on. You know, now we're not surprised, we know what you're doing, and that's real big to the air traffic. They don't like unknowns. They want to know what to expect. Now, other airports, like some of the Chicago suburban airports that I'm at pretty frequently, they're very busy, and yeah, they don't have time for that. So they don't, hey, if you're doing that, great, don't even call us up. So you kind of need to call up and know. If it's non-movement, you can do it anyway, but we want to work together with our air traffic control brothers and sisters and make sure that we are partners in this, and it's going to be different from one facility to another. Bill?
Just one comment. I am aware, my background, that often contract-powered airports, regional, you may go visit, don't put movement area markings because they're waiting a year from now. They're going to recoat the runway, the taxiway, and they don't want to spend the money and then just cover it up. So often they're operating on a waiver, and I've told all my students, you go to a new tower, particularly contract tower, not a hub airport, but like Appleton or Frederick, Maryland, something, before you take your feet off the brakes to the ramp in front of the FBO, call around. That's the safest thing to do. If you're in the non-movement area, they'll tell you. Otherwise, you don't know. I actually wrote a letter of defense for a guy who got violated at a contract towered airport. They didn't have movement area markers. He went 10 feet inside of it, they violated him. And I said, how can you persecute somebody when you're not following your own internal guidance? And they dropped the case. But that's not the point.
Yep.
If you're not sure, talk.
Yep, uncertainty is never a good thing in aviation. We always want to know. And again, they're glad to talk to you. Most of these airports, they want to talk to you. So why take the chance? Just make that call up on the radio and get information on that. So taxi, a lot of this. Back to communications a little bit. I'm going to skip by a couple of these to make sure that we've got it. We mentioned before that if you are told to do something, that is a clearance and it needs to be read back. And it can be long and complicated. Some of these taxi clearances now can be quite long at some airports, and you have to give that all back. And that can be a lot. How do I remember all that? Well, what's a good tool? One we mentioned before. Write it down. And it doesn't have to be on a piece of paper. Most of the students I fly with these days do it on their pads. There's ways to do it. I have not been able to do that yet. I still keep a piece of paper and a pad, but whatever, iPad or Android tablet or whatever. But write it down so that you can read it back correctly. That is just a very basic thing going on there. There are other good techniques. One that I like a lot, and the students really laugh at me, but it still really works, is the airport diagram and a highlighter. So as they tell you where to go, you just highlight that route, and then it's very easy, and plus you get the situational awareness and stuff. Again, the kids really think that's funny, but although I guess they can do it on the iPads and stuff too in a similar fashion. Just whatever, there's a bunch of different techniques out there, but have one because you have to read it back. I remember a very frustrated controller at Flying Cloud Airport up in Minnesota, which a couple years back, well, quite a few years back, was the second worst airport in the country for runway incursions. And so a lot of focus on that for a good reason, as you can imagine. But a controller was giving this gentleman a clearance to taxi, and it was quite a long one. And he would come back and say, Roger. So she would read it to him again, and he said, Roger again. And then I think a third time, and then I think he said, okay. And then she finally got on the radio with a little bit of edge in her voice saying, sir, I cannot let you proceed until you read back this entire clearance. And then at the end of the phone call, he did get the message to call the tower after his flight. So there was a little bit of edge in her voice as well. So don't be that person. Be ready, be able to write it down, be able to read it back, because you have to. Another thing to be aware of, it's in the same mode, is some of the middle-sized airports now, the Class Charlies in particular, are getting much, much more aggressive about asking VFR pilots to enter and leave the Class Charlie airport in a certain way. So just last week I was flying out of Madison, and when you take off on runway 36 at Madison, they ask you to stay below 1,600 feet. And I would say, well, hey, I'm VFR. I'm supposed to be able to go wherever I want. Well, not in controlled airspace. In controlled airspace, I got to go where they tell me. So when they told me 1,600 feet or under, they had to hear me say back on frequency, stay below 1,600 feet. And again, that's the contract. Now when I say that, I read it back to them, they know that I'm going to stay under 1,600 feet. You might also get vectors. VFR pilots may often be told to take a certain heading at a certain altitude in these kinds of airports. So don't be surprised if you don't fly those kind of airports very often, because it's becoming a much more common procedure in these Class Charlies. And you are obligated to follow that as a VFR pilot. Now, if you can't do it, we again have a magic word, right? Unable. And maybe you won't be able to depart the airport if you're not able to, but at least you don't have to do it. But once you read it back, you do have to do it because you've made the contract. And most of the time, they're not asking VFR pilots to do IFR type of stuff. It's going to be a heading and an altitude, or sometimes just above or below a certain altitude. It's pretty easy stuff to comply with. But back to the comment that Bill had before about non-movement areas, if you have any question in your mind about what to do, what do? Ask. Just ask. That's all you got to do. And again, there's not going to get dinged on your record or anything like that. You're going to actually make the controller happy because now they know that you're going to do it right. And that's what they want. That's what we all want out of this. All right. Get to a couple quick things here. Gary, are you still up there? So yeah, let's play this video of a very famous accident from Quincy, Illinois. Let's analyze it the same way we did the Allentown one. From Warren's neck of the woods.
It's a few minutes after sunset on a chilly November afternoon in the Midwest, and the Beech 1900 regional airliner has just reported 10 miles north of the non-towered Quincy, Illinois airport, inbound for runway 13. On the ground, a Beech King Air is preparing to depart on runway 4, and behind it, a new private pilot in the Piper Cherokee is waiting his turn for the same runway.
Quincy traffic, King Air 1127 Delta, holding short of runway 4. Taking the runway for departure and heading southeast to Quincy.
The transmission catches the attention of the airline crew, who are planning to land on the intersecting runway 13. 25 seconds later, they announce their position for a second time.
Quincy area traffic, Lakes Air 251 is a Beech airliner currently just about to turn a 6-mile final for runway 13. More like a 5-mile final for runway 13 at Quincy.
In the meantime, the King Air has taxied onto runway 4 and stopped, apparently to complete some last-minute pre-takeoff items. For reasons that are unclear, the two pilots of the King Air are paying little, if any, attention to the CTAF. Another 45 seconds pass, and the 1900 is now on short final for runway 13. From the air, its crew can see the King Air still holding in position on the intersecting runway.
In Quincy traffic, Lakes Air 251 is on a short final for runway 13. The aircraft going to hold in position on runway 4, or are you guys going to take off?
The response comes not from the King Air, whose crew is apparently still preoccupied, but from the inexperienced pilot of the Cherokee, waiting at the threshold of runway 4.
7646 Juliet, holding for departure on runway 4.
Mistakenly believing this transmission is from the pilot of the King Air, the crew of the 1900 thanks him for his courtesy.
Okay, well, we'll get through your intersection in just a second, sir. We appreciate that.
But the King Air is no longer holding in position. It's starting its takeoff roll, and the relative positions of the converging aircraft are such that the airline crew doesn't see the King Air until it's too late.
Max reverse. Oh!
The relatively low-speed collision leaves both aircraft largely intact. But fire, smoke, and a jammed exit door on the 1900 prevent any of the occupants from escaping. The tragedy holds clear lessons for pilots. At non-towered airports, moving into position and holding on a runway is a bad idea. And inappropriate or ill-timed communication, even if well-intentioned, can lead to serious misunderstandings. The accident also shows the importance of listening to the CTAF and visually clearing the departure path prior to takeoff, especially if a runway intersection lies ahead.
Would you all agree with the conclusions that the narrator had there? Notice one of those was visually clearing the runway, same issue we had at Allentown. In these conditions, and we know that the airline, the 1900 pilots, actually did see the King Air, but they made the call, they were concerned about it, made the call, and heard, unfortunately not from the correct pilot, that they weren't going to go, so their attention went ahead. Understandable that they would do that, isn't it? But it's the old thing about, Ronald Reagan and the Russians and all that. Trust but verify. It might not have been a bad idea in that situation, particularly in that case where they had a two-pilot crew, to still be watching that King Air, to not divert from that. Another little piece of that Air Safety Institute strongly recommends: at a non-towered airport, don't use your N number. Nobody can see your N number. If that Piper pilot would have, instead of saying N whatever he is, would have said, the Piper is holding short, would that have tipped off the airline crew that it was the wrong airplane? Yeah, very much the case. And when you're flying to pancake breakfasts and those kinds of things coming in, there's a lot of these airplanes. Giving your N number is next to meaningless. And in fact, I'd make the case that it's worsely meaningless because it takes longer to give your N number than to say the yellow Cessna or the blue Piper or whatever. And those of you that fly experimentals, it's instead of giving your N number, knowing that you're a high performance experimental or a low and slow experimental is much more valuable to me than your N number as a piece of that. Bill?
If you say experimental, that's like saying an N number. Say RV or Lancer or what? People know what they look like.
Yeah. Yep, give them some, although it's a little hard because there are some experimentals that,
Sure.
yeah, but the common ones, the RVs and the Kit Foxes and all those kind of things, and most of us have a pretty good sense of those. So that's much, much more valuable because that's something that we can see and correlate to, and it gives us more information. Like we're at the airport and we're in the pattern and somebody calls in and says, I'm in a Lancer and I'm 5 miles away. How soon am I going to see them? Real quick. Whereas they say they're in a Piper Cub, I got some time here. So that kind of information helps all of us as pilots. So we really encourage you to do that. Now, the totally different story in the tower environment. You need to use your N number there. You're required to use your N number there. The non-towered environment, you don't. And there, put yourself in the shoes of the other pilots that you're sharing the airspace with, and use the information that you would want to know about their airplane as we go forward. And by the way, we have a seminar that we'll be doing over in the AOPA tent on this exact topic, non-towered airports, on Wednesday morning. So if that's something that any of you fly from that kind of airport regularly, got some pretty interesting accidents that we'll be studying to learn a little bit more about this whole issue. Okay, finish this thing off here. Another really key thing that we can do is plan ahead what we're going to do. And a lot of us IFR pilots are very used to this from the flying standpoint. And what I would advocate here is that all of us, VFR and IFR alike, need to do the same thing on the ground. Take a look at that taxi diagram, figure out where you are, where at the FBO or the T-hangars, wherever you happen to be. Think about the winds and what's most likely to be the runway that's in use, if it's not already announced on ATIS, or if you're at a non-towered airport, just from hearing the other airplanes, and make a plan. I'm going to leave here, I'm turning left there, I'm going to go here. When I get to this runway, I'm going to clear both directions before I cross it, and continue on. Kind of have a plan of what you're going to do. And it sounds very easy, but our research tells us that very few pilots do that. Maybe because it is easy. So make that extra effort to really plot this whole thing out. And then at bigger airports, like I was mentioning with the Class Charlies now, by listening on the radio and you hear that, geez, the last 3 little airplane pilots have all been told to take a heading of 250 and stay above 3,000 feet 3 miles from the airport. Okay, I bet that's going to happen to me too. That kind of planning can really add to the overall safety of the effort. Along the same lines,
according to the ATIS, will on the west ramp today. They'll probably give us runway 18. Taxiway Golf is closed north of Juliet, so we won't be taking that route to get to the end of 18. We'll probably taxi east on Echo instead. Since there's 10,000 feet of runway left at that point, they'll probably give us an intersection departure there. If not, we'll have to be careful not to cross 18 to get to Delta unless we're cleared to do so. We'll also be taxiing diagonally across runway 14.
It sounds like a lot of information, but is any of that hard? Is any of that stuff any pilot should be able to do? Yeah, absolutely. Now, and particularly in a case like this, with a complicated airport, with construction going on, obviously, and things like that, boy, those are the times where we really want to be paying extra attention and really making that extra effort. We need to do it all the time, but we need to add to our anxiety level a little bit in this kind of a situation. Say, hey, this is unusual. This is outside of normal operations, so I want to be really on my game here. And if we have another pilot with us, can we include them in the process? Absolutely. The way professional pilots do this is before they push back, they pull out one of these things and they do the exact kind of briefing that we just talked about, and they have to agree on the plan before they go. If they don't agree, then they got to get it settled out. And so we can do the same thing as GA pilots, and it can be very, very healthy because that other pilot might know something you don't know. And plus, they're on the other side of the airplane, they're going to see things that you can't see. So make use of that. And even non-pilots can be very helpful for it. Certainly those of you that fly regularly with a significant other, that person, let them know that, tell me if you see an airplane coming down on your side of the airplane. I want to know that kind of stuff. I've been surprised at the number of times where a passenger has been surprised when I've asked them to let me know about the things that they see, including airplanes in the air too. They don't know how important this is to us. So say it to them. I would like you to share that information with me when you see it. Of course, it's really fun then when you are up there in the air and airliners going over at 30,000 feet with a contrail. Oh, there's an airplane up there. But you thank them. You say, oh, thank you for sharing that. And we're good. We're good. We're not going to hit it. Same thing for the arrival. One of the best things we can do to stay out of trouble on the ground after landing is to have a plan. Now, the plan might need to change, and, particularly at Howard Airport. The plan's going to be somewhat dictated by ATC. But regardless, in advance, we should have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Simply by looking at the airport diagram, thinking about the runways that are in use, what the situation with the wind is, and where we want to end up. And this is an opportunity as well. Sometimes at some of these airports, by having that plan, all the traffic seems to be landing on a certain runway, and as you arrive and you see that, boy, my life would be a lot easier if I could land on, like at Midway, if you can land on 22 right instead of 22 left, boy, what a difference that would make. Just ask. Just ask. They're not always going to give you what you ask for, but my experience has been most of the time they will. And that makes everybody's life a little bit easier. Controllers are busy folks, and they've got a lot of things going on, and they get into these patterns, these ruts, just like pilots do. And it just may not have crossed their mind that, oh boy, this guy's going to be going, this gal's going over to the FBO, and so let's put them on the right runway instead of the left runway. Yeah, they just didn't have the opportunity to think about it. So when you ask, they say, oh yeah, that'll be fine. Maybe. It's up to them.
According to the ATIS, we'll be landing on runway 18 right. Runway 18 left is NOTAM closed for construction. Taxiway Echo is closed south of Echo 4, so that means we won't be using Taxiway Lima to cross to the east side of the airport. We'll probably end up taxiing to the GA ramp via Taxiways Whiskey, Kilo, Juliet, and Echo.
Now, even if you're by yourself in the airplane, it's a good idea to do this out loud. Just like we talked about at the very beginning of the morning about writing down those clearances because it gets you to use different parts of your brain. If you are in your cockpit, you're still 15, 20 miles from the airport, and you've listened to ATIS, and you know what the winds are, and you go through and you do this, and you say it to yourself, don't hold your push-to-talk down, the ATC doesn't need to hear it, but you to yourself say the kinds of things like this pilot just said, that is going to be much more valuable to you than if you just think about it. And again, there's some science behind this, the way the human brain works and the connection between the brain and the mouth, which some people, it's a weak connection, but for most pilots it's pretty good. So keep that, that connection. But we know scientifically that if you say it out loud, you will think about it more than if you just think about it. So it's a neat little trick, very useful little trick. Okay, and then last but not least, just real quickly about our airports themselves. The air traffic people and the airports people from the FAA have put a lot of work into identifying hot spots. Many of these get generated by you and me screwing up. If there's a whole bunch of runway incursions at a certain spot, the FAA analyzes that. And when I say the FAA, I mean Flight Standards and the airport's office and the ATC. And they say, what can we do so we don't have all these runway incursions anymore? And one of the most common answers is, let's tell everybody about it so that they don't make the same mistake. And that's what we call a hot spot. And does anybody know where we would find out as a pilot that an airport we're flying to has hot spots? Where would we find that? On the taxi diagrams is one of the good places. And then there's others. Bill?
FAA.gov.
FAA.gov.
Airport, pull it down, airport safety, hotspots, right there.
So a very, very simple way. And you can look it up by airport there, correct, Bill? So you can get these kind of things in advance. And then there's typically some text. On the airport diagram, it might be tucked off in a corner and whatever. On the FAA site, they're actually done more in the AFD type of a format. But it will actually say, be aware of this because there's two intersections that come together at the same angle or something like that. They'll kind of tell you what to look for. This should be a standard part of your pre-flight briefing as a pilot. The airport I'm departing from, does it have any hotspots? If it does, as part of your pre-flight briefing, read that through and know, hey, this is a spot where a lot of other pilots got in trouble, so I'm not going to get in trouble there. And then along the same thing for your destination airport, make sure that doesn't have any hot spots, or if they do, study those hot spots so that you're ready for them. And even potentially an alternate airport if you have some possibility of perhaps going into your alternate. It's good information. It's very, very valuable to have. And the way we get those is kind of interesting and something I'd like to commend to you. It's something called an RSAT. We'll get to that real quick here, which is called a Runway Safety Action Team. And any airport with a tower, whether it's a federal tower or a contract tower, is required to have a meeting with the airport's users on some periodic basis. And it varies depending on the size of the airport and stuff, but typically once a year. And you are a user of your airport. And what they do is at these meetings, they'll sit down, and I attend at several airports here in this region very regularly, and the start of the meeting typically is to look at any runway incursions that we've had or things like that. And we talk about them and say, okay, what can we do? And then if there have been some of those, well, one of the things might be to define a hotspot. But then another thing will come out, because remember, it's not just pilots, it's the users of the airport. So this is the baggage truck drivers and the fuel truck drivers, folks like that. And we've had, at one of the meetings I was at recently, a fuel truck driver saying he was really confused about where the line was between the perimeter road and one of the ramps. And so because of that, the airport manager put in a new line, so some of those kind of things. They need our perspective. These meetings tend to be dominated by other people than general aviation, particularly at airports that have airlines. So if those of you that operate from a towered airport regularly, you might consider contacting the tower management and asking to be put on the list to come to the next RSAT meeting. And I strongly encourage you to do that because they need our perspective as GA pilots. The world looks different from the cockpit of a Cessna or a Piper than it does from the cockpit of a CRJ or an Airbus. So, the FAA is very strong on this. Airports have to be for all users, not just the big ones. At least so far. We'll see where the ATC privatization goes. But for right now, it's all of us have equal say. And so we need to be at that table, and I hope you all will consider doing that. And I think you will find that your input will be very welcome. You know, the tower personnel and stuff, they're looking for opportunities to interact with private pilots as well. And I think that's about it. So any questions? Yes, one in the back. Here comes Pat with your microphone.
Hi, I'm Bob Arthurs. I'm out of Hilo, Hawaii, and the last RSAT meeting I sat down on was on runway incursions. Now, if you're on parallel runways and the runway safety area isn't quite wide enough, there's 2 airports in the nation that you will easily get a violation. Honolulu is one of them. I don't know if you have the slide up there, but guaranteed most general aviation pilots or drivers using the taxiway will immediately get confused.
Yeah, that is a very famous example because it's a very unique configuration there. And yes, there's been a lot of runway incursions because of it. If any of you are interested, there's a very good article in AOPA. If you go to AOPA's website and Google Honolulu taxiway or runway, you'll find information about it. Yes?
I'll give a quick verbal description of it. The space between the 2 the stop lines, hold short lines, is just big enough to stick a Cessna or 182 in it. And if you do it, you've got a violation.
Yeah, the whole short lines for the runways overlap each other. So there's this dead man zone in between. Yeah, it's very, again, look at the articles. This is a good one. Yes, Jason's.
ADSB ground operations for your transponder, where I've never seen where they've actually told you not to have continue.
Thank you for asking the question. This is a very important change from a couple years back that I hope you all have heard about, but unfortunately a lot of us haven't.
Excuse me, Andy.
It's actually ADS, it's not ADSB, it's another version of it, ADSX, I believe it is? SDX?
The gentleman didn't, over on this side, didn't hear the question from the gentleman over there.
Okay, the question is, if we are operating at an airport that uses this ADSB technology, or not ADSB, but ADSEX technology, what should we be doing with our transponders? And I'm going to take a step back and just overall, they've changed the training now in that you are supposed to leave your transponder on mode C all the time unless otherwise instructed. Most of us were trained that you put it on standby, and when you get to the runway, you put it on alt. After you land, you put it back to standby. And that is no longer true. Now, you leave it on alt all the time. And the reason is it's not ADSB, it's this different technology that's kind of similar to ADSB that can see you on the runway surfaces. And they want to see you. And it'll say right on the taxi diagram, in fact, to leave on your mode C or whatever. Now ADSB itself is a component of that, and that's part of the evolution that the FAA is going through towards the next gen as they integrate. Right now the ADSB is largely airborne operations, but eventually more of that will be incorporated in ground operations as well. So stay tuned for that, but the bottom line is for you as a pilot, keep your transponder on alt all the time unless otherwise told, and pretty much the only time you will be told not to will be because you're not giving the correct altitude. The controllers, when you check in and check your altitude, you're going to be off, and that causes a lot of problems on the controller side, so they'll ask you to turn it to standby. But other than that, and other than Oshkosh, yeah, for those of you that flew into Oshkosh, you had, but that was a little different situation for that. That's very rare. Okay, well, thanks so much for, one more question and we'll call her a day.
You have a presentation Wednesday at EAA. What time is that?
At AOPA, and that'll be at the AOPA Pavilion, and that one will be at noon. Yep, noon to 12:45 on non-towered operations. So thanks so much for coming, everybody, this morning. Have a great week. It's going to be a really good one. Really enjoyed being with you all here this morning.